You learned very early that wanting something was risky, not dangerous in a dramatic way, just uncomfortable, like it shifted something in the room that didn't settle easily afterward. So before you ever asked, you learned to hesitate. You learned to check whether it was the right time, whether someone seemed busy, whether your request would feel like an inconvenience. And most of the time, you decided it wasn't worth it. This video is about you if, as a child, you learned not to ask for what you needed. Not because you didn't have needs, not because you were independent by nature, but because asking felt like it came with a cost. You noticed how requests were received, how sighs appeared, how tone shifted, how attention sometimes withdrew just slightly, and you learned to do the math quietly in your head. Is this important enough? Can I manage without it? Would it be easier to just let it go? So you stopped asking for help. You stopped asking for reassurance. You stopped asking for comfort unless it felt absolutely necessary. You learned how to adapt instead. You figured things out on your own. You waited things out. You told yourself you didn't really need much anyway. From the outside, this often looked like maturity, like strength, like self-sufficiency. But on the inside, it was something else. It was a constant weighing of desire against disruption, a quiet habit of minimizing yourself before anyone else had to. And over time, this didn't feel like a choice anymore. Felt like common sense. You became the child who didn't ask, who didn't want to bother anyone, who learned to live with unanswered needs. And even now, that instinct may still be there, not as a memory but as a reflex. This pattern doesn't begin because a child wants to be independent. It begins because a child is learning what happens after they ask. You weren't born believing that needing something was a problem. You learned it through repetition, through small moments that added up. Maybe requests were met with delay, with distraction, with answers that came eventually but without warmth. Maybe help arrived, but it felt heavy, like it cost something, like it added pressure to someone who already seemed full. Or maybe your needs were compared to others, minimized, brushed past with phrases meant to calm, not to understand. So you started to notice patterns. You noticed when asking led to tension, when reassurance came with irritation, when comfort felt conditional, available, but inconvenient. No one had to say, "Don't ask." The environment said it for them. And because you were a child, you adapted quickly. You learned to anticipate what you would be told. You answered your own questions before anyone else had to. You figured out how to manage without drawing attention. When something felt uncertain, you waited. When something hurt, you held it quietly. When you needed support, you tried to provide it to yourself first. This wasn't resilience. It was self-containment. A child who learns not to ask is a child who senses that support is unreliable, not absent but inconsistent, present but emotionally thin. So instead of risking disappointment, you lowered your expectations. You learned that wanting less hurt less, that asking less kept things smoother, that relying on yourself felt safer than hoping someone else would show up. Over time, this adaptation settled into the body. You stopped reaching outward. You turned inward instead. You became skilled at enduring quietly. And because this strategy worked, because it reduced friction, your nervous system held on to it. It learned that silence preserved stability, that self-sufficiency protected connection, that asking was something to avoid unless absolutely necessary. And once that lesson is learned early, it doesn't fade on its own. It simply waits to be carried forward. You might notice that this pattern followed you into adulthood. Even now, asking doesn't come easily. Not because you don't know how, but because something in you tightens before the words leave your mouth. You may rehearse requests silently, edit them down, decide they're unnecessary before anyone else has to. You tell yourself it's fine. You'll handle it. You don't really need help anyway. And often people experience you as capable, independent, low maintenance, someone who doesn't make demands. But inside, there's a quieter reality. You hesitate even when you're overwhelmed. You wait until things become unbearable before reaching out. And by then, the need feels heavier, harder to explain. You might struggle to ask for reassurance, even in close relationships. You fear sounding needy. You worry about being too much. So you soften your requests. You frame them carefully. You add disclaimers. It's not a big deal. Only if you're not busy. It's okay if not. And sometimes you don't ask at all. This can create a strange kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of carrying everything yourself while others assume you're fine. You may feel unseen in moments where support could have helped. Not because people don't care, but because you never learned how to let them in. And the conflict lives here, logically, that asking is allowed. You know that relationships are meant to be reciprocal. You know that needing support doesn't make you weak. But your body still remembers something else. It remembers the cost of asking, the subtle withdrawal, the disappointment that followed unmet needs. So even when support is available, your system hesitates. You default to endurance, to self-reliance, to silence. And over time, this creates fatigue. Not from doing too much, but from doing everything alone. Because the child who learned not to ask often becomes the adult who doesn't know how to receive. And that weight, carried quietly for years, has a way of shaping how close life is allowed to get. There is nothing broken about the way you learned to survive. You didn't stop asking because you lacked courage. You didn't become self-sufficient because you didn't value connection. You learned not to ask because at one time asking felt uncertain, because support felt inconsistent, because relying on yourself reduced disappointment. That was intelligence. That was adaptation. Your nervous system did exactly what it needed to do to keep connection intact and pain manageable. So when you still hesitate before asking for help, when you still downplay your needs, when receiving feels unfamiliar or uncomfortable, it isn't failure. It's memory. Your body remembers a time when wanting more didn't feel safe. When needing something meant risking frustration, delay, or withdrawal. And it learned to protect you by making self-reliance automatic. You don't need to force yourself to ask more. You don't need to shame yourself for staying quiet. This isn't about becoming dependent. It's about noticing that the world you're in now is not the same one you adapted to. There may be people in your life who can respond differently. Moments where support is available without cost. Spaces where your needs don't threaten connection. Learning to recognize those moments takes time, because receiving is not just a behavior, it's a sense of safety. And safety, once learned as unreliable, has to be felt again slowly. You didn't stop asking because you didn't deserve care. You stopped asking because care once felt uncertain. You learned to carry yourself when no one else could. And even now, you are allowed to need without apologizing first.